The glass shattered before anyone understood what had happened. It wasn't loud, just the fragile crack of a champagne flute slipping from trembling fingers. But in the candlelit hush of Harlem's most exclusive dining room, it might as well have been a gunshot. Every head turned. The little girl froze, and the billionaire, standing beside her table, looked like she had forgotten how to breathe. "She's with me." The words weren't sharp. They weren't angry. They were steady, calm, certain. But they changed everything. The restaurant sat 50 floors above Lenox Avenue, all polished marble and golden light. The kind of place where deals were whispered over caviar, and people wore watches worth more than most mortgages. A string quartet played near the window, their music floating softly over conversations about IPOs and acquisitions and the kind of money that moved markets and shaped skylines. Zuri Okafor didn't belong there. Her sneakers were scuffed, the left one held together with a thin line of fabric glue she had applied that morning before school. Her brown curls were tied back with a pink elastic that had lost its stretch weeks ago, and she was clutching a paper gift bag decorated with hand-drawn stars that she had spent all of Sunday afternoon perfecting at the kitchen table while her father made dinner. She was 8 years old, and she was standing alone beside the most powerful woman in the room. Naomi Ashford was used to attention. At 34, she was the only daughter of tech magnate Solomon Ashford, heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire built on cloud computing and defense contracts. Business magazines called her the Ebony Architect. Investors called her brilliant. Employees called her intimidating. She had graced the cover of every major financial publication in the country before she turned 30, and she ran her father's company with the kind of precision that made people forget she had inherited the position and assume she had built it herself. She had in many ways. Solomon Ashford had founded Ashford Dynamics in a basement apartment in Bed-Stuy 42 years ago, writing code on a second-hand computer while his wife Lorraine worked double shifts as a nurse at Kings County Hospital. By the time Naomi was born, the company had moved from the basement to a modest office on Fulton Street. By the time she was 10, they had relocated to a glass tower in Midtown. By the time she was 20, Ashford Dynamics was a household name, and Solomon was being profiled by magazines that had never bothered to learn how to pronounce his Igbo surname correctly until his net worth made it worth their effort. Naomi had attended private schools after the money came, but she remembered public school. She remembered PS 247 on Nostrand Avenue, with its peeling paint and broken water fountains, and the classroom where Mrs. Delacroix had taught her to read using books she had bought with her own money because the school budget didn't cover enough copies for every student. She remembered the sound of rain dripping through ceiling tiles into plastic buckets lined up along the hallway like an indoor river system. She remembered being 8 years old and not understanding why some schools had computers and libraries and art rooms, and hers had none of those things but did have mice in the walls and a boiler that broke every February. Those memories lived in a locked room inside her chest, behind the composure and the tailored suits and the carefully managed public image. She had not visited that room in a very long time. She had not needed to. Her life now was structured, strategic, and insulated by layers of privilege and protocol that kept the past at a comfortable distance. But in that moment, as Zuri stood beside her table, small and wide-eyed and clearly out of place in a room designed to exclude everyone who looked like either of them would have looked 25 years ago, Naomi felt something she hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. "Sweetheart," Naomi said carefully, lowering her voice, aware that every nearby table was pretending not to stare. "Are you lost?" Zuri shook her head. "No, ma'am. I'm not lost." Her voice wobbled, the way voices do when courage is still wet and hasn't dried into confidence yet. I needed to find you." A ripple of murmurs spread through the dining room. Naomi's security team, positioned discreetly near the entrance, had already stiffened. 2 men in dark suits with earpieces and the kind of calm that comes from years of anticipating threats shifted their weight and began moving. The maitre d', a tall, elegant man named Clarence who had managed this dining room for 15 years and prided himself on the seamless orchestration of every evening, looked like he might faint. Children didn't wander into private executive dinners. Not in this building. Not on this floor. Not without an invitation engraved on cardstock thick enough to stop a bullet. Naomi offered a tight, diplomatic smile. Find me. I'm afraid you have it wrong. She's with me. The man's voice carried across the room, smooth and controlled, yet threaded with something deeper. Protectiveness, maybe, or the quiet determination of someone who has walked into rooms where he wasn't welcome before and decided to stay anyway. Heads turned again. Marcus Okafor stood near the elevators, one hand resting lightly on his daughter's shoulder as if anchoring her to the earth. He wasn't dressed for this room. His suit was clean, navy blue, pressed that morning on ironing board set up in the narrow hallway of their apartment in Jamaica, Queens, but it was clearly off the rack. His tie was slightly crooked, a detail he had noticed in the elevator's mirrored doors, and then chosen not to fix because his daughter was holding his hand and he didn't want to let go. His shoes were polished by hand, not by valet. 3 coats of wax applied at the kitchen table that afternoon, while Zuri sat across from him, finishing her homework and asking every few minutes if they were really going to do this. He looked like a man who worked hard. He also looked like a man who wasn't afraid. Not of the security team, now openly watching him. Not of the crystal chandeliers, or the linen tablecloths, or the collective net worth of the room, which probably exceeded the GDP of several small nations. He was afraid of only one thing, and that was letting his daughter down. Zuri exhaled in visible relief. Dad. Naomi's eyes flicked between them, assessing the situation with the speed of someone who made 1,000-variable calculations before breakfast every morning. The man was clearly the girl's father. Same deep brown skin, same wide, curious eyes, same stubborn set to the jaw that suggested they didn't back down easily. He wasn't a threat. He was a parent. And the girl, this small person in scuffed sneakers, standing in a $50 million dining room, was looking at Naomi with an expression that combined terror and hope in equal measure. "You're aware this is a private event?" Naomi asked, her tone cool but not cruel. Professional, the way she was professional in boardrooms and conference calls and the 100 daily interactions that required her to be precise without being personal. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. I am." Security had started moving again. 2 men approaching from the left with the practiced casualness of people trained to neutralize situations without creating scenes. Naomi lifted a single hand, stopping them mid-step. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The men stopped. The room watched. "Then perhaps you can explain," she said evenly. Marcus swallowed, not out of fear, but out of humility. The kind of humility that comes not from weakness, but from understanding exactly where you stand and choosing to stand there anyway. "My daughter wanted to thank you." A faint, confused crease appeared between Naomi's brows. The expression was foreign on her face. Confusion was not something Naomi Ashford experienced often. She had built her entire adult life around the elimination of uncertainty, the control of variables, the systematic reduction of surprise. And yet here she was, surprised by a mechanic and his 8-year-old daughter in a dining room where surprises were explicitly not on the menu. "For what?" she asked. Zuri stepped forward before her father could answer. She thrust the paper gift bag toward Naomi with both hands, her small fingers gripping the handles so tightly that the paper crinkled and the hand-drawn stars distorted. The bag was purple because purple was Zuri's favorite color, and the stars were gold because Mrs. Delacroix, who was still teaching at PS 247 on Nostrand Avenue 30 years later, had told the class that gold stars meant something special. "For my school," Zuri said. The room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people resuming their conversations at lower volumes, but the absolute silence of 50 people collectively holding their breath. Naomi blinked. "I'm sorry. Our school was going to close," Zuri continued, her words tumbling out now that she had started, the dam of rehearsed sentences breaking under the pressure of the moment. "The roof leaks when it rains, and we don't have enough computers, and the heat doesn't always work in winter, and Mrs. Tate said we might have to merge with another district because there wasn't enough money to fix everything, and some kids are going to have to take a bus for a whole hour just to get to school, and..." She took a breath, a deep shuddering breath that made her small chest rise and fall like a bird's. But you gave money, and now we don't have to. Recognition flickered in Naomi's eyes like a match striking in a dark room. 3 months ago, her foundation, the Ashford Community Initiative, had quietly funded a grant for under-resourced public schools in Brooklyn. It had been a line item on a spreadsheet, one of 47 grants approved during a quarterly review meeting that had lasted exactly 90 minutes. The proposal had come from a program officer named Devin Williams, who had identified 7 schools in critical need of infrastructure funding. PS 247 on Nostrand Avenue was number 4 on the list. Naomi remembered approving the grant. She remembered the number, $3.2 million, distributed across the 7 schools. She remembered signing the authorization while simultaneously reviewing a merger proposal on her second monitor and listening to a conference call on her Bluetooth earpiece. Multitasking was her native language. The grant had been a strategic philanthropic investment advised by her board. Good PR, good optics, smart business. A line item, a checkbox, a decimal point in a financial universe of very large numbers. She hadn't visited. She hadn't met a single student. She hadn't seen the leaky roof or the broken computers or the classroom where Mrs. Tate explained to 23 8-year-olds that their school might not exist next year. It was philanthropy at altitude, generous and genuine, but delivered from such a height that the people it touched were invisible. She hadn't expected a child to show up in person. "You came all the way here for that?" Naomi asked softly. The coolness in her voice had melted without her permission, replaced by something warmer and more vulnerable than she had allowed herself to feel in public in a very long time. Zuri nodded so vigorously that her curls bounced. "Mrs. Tate said you probably wouldn't remember. She said important people get asked for money all the time, and they can't remember everyone they help. But my dad says it's important to say thank you when someone helps you, even if they're too busy to hear it." Naomi felt something press against her ribs from the inside. A memory she hadn't visited in years, rising unbidden from the locked room in her chest. She was 8 years old, standing in the hallway of PS 247, watching rain drip through the ceiling into plastic buckets, while Mrs. Delacroix guided her class around the puddles and pretended everything was fine. She remembered the shame of knowing that her school was falling apart and that nobody important enough to fix it seemed to care. She remembered the exact moment she had decided that if she ever had the power to change things, she would. And she had changed things. She had. The grant was real. The money was real. The roof would be fixed, and the computers would be purchased, and PS 247 would survive another year. But standing here now, looking into the eyes of a child who had traveled across 2 boroughs to deliver a handmade card to a stranger, Naomi realized that she had been writing checks from so far away that she had forgotten what the money meant to the people who received it. She had turned generosity into a transaction and called it philanthropy. $100 million in annual revenue. A company valued at $12 billion. A calendar booked in 15-minute increments from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. And somehow this 8-year-old had just undone her. "Your dad's right," Naomi said quietly. "It is important to say thank you." She looked at Marcus, then really looked at him. Not the quick assessment she had performed earlier, categorizing him by his clothes and his posture and his probable tax bracket. She looked at him the way she looked at investment proposals she wanted to understand fully, with attention and patience and the willingness to be wrong about her first impression. There were faint grease stains near his cuffs, the kind that didn't come out no matter how many times you washed them. His hands were rough, the knuckles slightly swollen, the nails trimmed short but bearing the permanent shadows of motor oil and transmission fluid. Not a banker, not an investor, not anyone who belonged in this room by the metrics this room used to define belonging. But he stood with his back straight and his eyes level and his hand on his daughter's shoulder, and he looked like he belonged exactly where he was. "What do you do, Mr. Okafor?" Naomi asked. "I'm a mechanic," he replied. "Own a small shop in Jamaica, Queens. Okafor's Auto on Sutphin Boulevard. Been there 11 years. And you brought your daughter into this room, full of strangers, because she wanted to express gratitude?" Marcus didn't hesitate. The answer came with the kind of quiet conviction that doesn't need volume to make itself heard. "Yes, ma'am. Weren't you worried about security?" About appearances? He gave a small shrug. The shrug of a man who had spent his life being measured by people who didn't know him and had long ago stopped letting their measurements define him. My daughter's courage matters more than my comfort. That did it. The tight, polished composure Naomi Ashford had spent a lifetime perfecting cracked. Not dramatically. Not publicly. No one watching would have seen it. No quiver of the lip. No visible tears. No Hollywood moment of emotional collapse. But inside, in the locked room where she kept her 8-year-old self and her memories of leaky ceilings and borrowed books and a mother who worked double shifts, so her daughter could have a future, something shifted. A wall that had been standing for 26 years developed a fracture, thin as a hair, but deep enough to let light through. She pulled out a chair. "Would you both join me?" Gasps fluttered across linen-covered tables like startled birds. At the next table, a hedge fund manager named Reginald Holloway lowered his fork and stared. 3 tables away, a pharmaceutical executive named Vivian St. James leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind her hand. Near the window, the string quartet's cellist lost her place in the music for half a measure before recovering. Marcus shook his head instinctively. "We couldn't possibly. This is your evening, and we've already." "You could," Naomi said gently. "And you will." The words were not a command. They were an invitation, offered with the warmth of someone who had just remembered how to be warm. Naomi pulled out a second chair, a smaller one brought quickly by a waiter who had been watching the exchange with wide eyes, and positioned it beside her own. Zuri's face lit up like fireworks over the Harlem River on the 4th of July. She looked at her father, her eyes enormous with hope and disbelief, and Marcus felt something crack in his own chest that matched whatever had cracked in Naomi's. He nodded. "Okay, baby. Let's sit down." They sat. The conversation at neighboring tables faltered and then resumed at lower frequencies, the way sound adjusts when something important is happening nearby, and people want to pretend they aren't listening while absolutely listening. A venture capitalist across the room, named Terrence Adeyemi, checked his watch, irritated that the evening's carefully curated atmosphere had been disrupted by something as unpredictable as sincerity. The evening's keynote speaker, a retired tech executive named Cordelia Price, who had been preparing remarks about innovation in the digital age, whispered to an assistant that perhaps she should revise her opening to include something about community. The assistant nodded and began typing furiously on a tablet. Naomi ignored all of it. She turned her full attention to Zuri and Marcus, the same attention she brought to billion-dollar negotiations and board strategy sessions, except that for the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't calculating outcomes or managing impressions. She was simply present. She asked Zuri about her favorite subject. "Science," Zuri said immediately, with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never been told to doubt her own interests. "I like learning about space. Did you know that the sun is actually a star? It's not even a big star. It's a medium star." Mrs. Tate said there are stars so big that if you put them where the sun is, they would swallow up Mercury and Venus and Earth and even Mars. "I didn't know that," Naomi said, "but I'd forgotten. Thank you for reminding me." "You're welcome." Zuri beamed. "Also, I like rocks. Not just regular rocks. Minerals. Did you know that diamonds are just carbon that got squeezed really hard for a really long time?" Naomi glanced down at the diamond on her right hand, a 4-carat stone set in platinum that her father had given her on her 30th birthday. She had never thought about it as carbon under pressure before. She smiled. She asked Zuri about her friends. "Too many to count," Zuri said, holding up all 10 fingers and then running out of capacity. "There's Amara and Destiny and Kai and Marcus Jr., who's not related to my dad, even though they have the same name. And there's Simone, who has the best braids in the whole school. And there's," she went on for several minutes. Naomi listened to every name. She asked Zuri what she wanted to be when she grew up. "A teacher," Zuri said firmly, without hesitation, without qualification, without the self-conscious hedging that adults learn to apply to their dreams. "So kids don't lose their schools." The words landed in the center of the table, like something precious and heavy. Marcus's throat tightened. He looked at his daughter, this small, determined person who had inherited her mother's wide smile and her father's stubbornness, and something else entirely, something that belonged only to her, a quality of compassion so natural and unforced that it made the adults around her feel like they were the ones who had something to learn. Naomi noticed. She watched Marcus watching Zuri, and she saw in his face the particular expression of a parent who realizes that the person they are raising has already surpassed them in the ways that matter most. "You're raising a remarkable human," she said quietly to him. Marcus met her eyes. There was no false modesty in his response, no deflection, no performance. Just the simple truth of a man who knew exactly what his priorities were and had never been confused about them. "I'm just trying to raise her kind," he answered. The simplicity of it hung in the air. Kind, not powerful, not wealthy, not influential, not strategic or optimized or positioned for maximum advantage. Kind. The word sat on the table between the crystal water glasses and the silver cutlery in the candlelight, and it was the most expensive thing in the room. Naomi looked at Marcus for a long moment, and something passed between them that neither of them could have named if asked. Recognition, maybe. The recognition that happens when two people who have been carrying heavy things in different directions suddenly realize they are walking the same road. She picked up the gift bag that Zuri had given her and opened it carefully. Inside was a folded card made from construction paper, the kind with the slightly fuzzy texture that smells like childhood and elementary school art rooms. The front was decorated in glitter glue, silver and gold and purple, applied with the generous hand of someone who believed that more glitter was always better. Inside, in careful handwriting that slanted slightly to the right, Zuri had written, "Dear Miss Ashford, thank you for helping our school. You are very kind and very important. I hope you have a good life. Love, Zuri Okafor, age 8, PS 247, Mrs. Tate's class." Beneath the card was a small ceramic star. It was crooked, painted yellow with uneven strokes, and had a small chip on one of its points where it had bumped against something during the subway ride from Queens to Harlem. It was the most imperfect object Naomi had touched in months, possibly years. Everything in her world was polished and precise and quality-controlled. This star was none of those things. It was made by 8-year-old hands in an art class that existed because a grant she had approved with a keystroke had kept the school open long enough for the art teacher to unpack her supplies. "I made it in art class," Zuri explained. "It's supposed to mean you're a star for helping people. Mrs. Tate said that when someone does something good, you should give them a star so they remember." A few guests shifted uncomfortably at nearby tables. This wasn't how these dinners went. This wasn't scripted. There was no press release prepared, no communications team standing by to draft social media posts. There was just an 8-year-old girl in scuffed sneakers handing a crooked ceramic star to a billionaire in a dining room that cost more to rent for one evening than most people earned in a month. Naomi held the star in her palm. It weighed almost nothing. It was worth almost nothing by any metric the world used to assign value. But she held it like it was the most important thing she had ever been given. Because in that moment it was... She thought about her office on the 47th floor of the Ashford Dynamics building on Broad Street, where her desk was made of Italian walnut, and her chair cost $6,000, and the view from her window encompassed the entire southern tip of Manhattan. She thought about the awards on her shelf, the crystal and platinum tributes from industry associations and charitable organizations, each one engraved with her name and a date and a tribute to her generosity or her vision or her leadership. She had 43 of them. She could not remember what most of them looked like. She would remember this star. "Your dad's right," Naomi said again, and this time her voice was not professional or composed or diplomatically calibrated. It was human. It is important to say thank you. And it's important to listen when someone says it. Halfway through dessert, a chocolate souffle that Zuri approached with the scientific curiosity of someone conducting an experiment in structural engineering, Naomi made a decision that would ripple far beyond that dining room. She turned to her assistant, a young woman named Keisha, who sat at a discreet table near the wall, monitoring Naomi's schedule on a tablet and fielding messages from 3 different time zones. "Cancel my 11 o'clock tomorrow." Keisha blinked. She had worked for Naomi for 2 years and had never once been asked to cancel the Tuesday morning board strategy session. It was the most important recurring meeting on the calendar, attended by the company's 7 most senior executives and used to set direction for the entire quarter. "Your board strategy session?" Keisha asked, her voice carefully neutral in the way that assistants learn to keep their voices when their bosses say something unexpected. "Yes," Naomi replied. She didn't explain. She didn't justify. She simply made the decision and moved on, the way she made every decision, with finality and without apology. Then she looked back at Zuri. "I'd like to visit your school." Zuri nearly knocked over her water glass. Her hand shot out and caught it at the last second, a reflex born of living in a small apartment where spilling things meant extra cleaning and wasted resources. But her eyes were enormous. "Really? Really? Really?" Marcus stared at Naomi. He had spent enough years dealing with people to know the difference between polite gestures and genuine intent. He had heard enough empty promises from landlords who said they would fix the plumbing and customers who said they would pay next week and politicians who said they would invest in the community to last several lifetimes. He searched Naomi's face for corporate politeness, for the glossy surface of a public commitment that would evaporate the moment the audience disappeared. He found none. What he found instead was something he recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. Resolution. The look of someone who has decided something and will not be moved from it. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. "You've already done more than enough." "I know," Naomi replied, and the way she said it made it clear that obligation had nothing to do with it. The next morning at 7:45, a Blacktown car pulled up to the curb outside PS 247 on Nostrand Avenue in Brooklyn. The school was a 3-story brick building that had been constructed in 1957 and had not been significantly renovated since the Carter administration. The front steps were cracked. The chain-link fence around the small concrete playground was rusted in several places. A hand-painted banner above the front door read, "Welcome to PS 247, home of the Hornets," and beneath it someone had taped a sheet of paper that said "Picture Day Thursday. Don't forget." Word had traveled fast that a billionaire was visiting. By 8 o'clock, cameras lined the cracked sidewalk. 3 local news vans were parked across the street. A reporter from a Brooklyn community newspaper was interviewing the crossing guard, who had been working at PS 247 for 22 years and had strong opinions about everything. But what the cameras captured wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't a billionaire arriving with an entourage and a press kit and a carefully staged photo opportunity. What they captured was Naomi Ashford, wearing flat shoes and a simple blazer, walking through the front door of PS 247 alone, except for Marcus and Zuri, who had insisted on being her guides. They captured Naomi kneeling on a classroom floor, her designer slacks pressed against linoleum that hadn't been replaced since the 90s, listening to a child named Amara explain a science project about constellations. The project was displayed on a trifold poster board decorated with aluminum foil stars and cotton ball clouds, and Amara spoke about Orion's belt with the authority of someone who had memorized every detail and was prepared to defend her thesis against any challenger, including billionaires. They captured Naomi climbing a ladder in the school gymnasium to inspect the patched roof herself, running her hand along the seams where repair tape had been applied over and over in layers that told the story of years of deferred maintenance. She stood on that ladder for 5 minutes, looking at the damage with the same analytical intensity she brought to engineering reports and quarterly projections. And when she came down, she asked the principal, a woman named Dr. Cynthia Abrams, who had been running PS 247 for 12 years on a budget that would make most CEOs weep, exactly how much it would cost to replace the entire roof. Dr. Abrams told her. Naomi nodded once and said she would handle it. They captured Naomi laughing, actually laughing, open-mouthed and unrehearsed, when a group of third graders asked if she was famous or just regular famous. She told them she was regular famous, which meant that most people had never heard of her, and the ones who had mostly wanted to talk about money, which was boring. The third graders agreed that money was boring and asked if she wanted to see their hamster instead. She did. They captured Marcus, standing quietly at the back of Mrs. Tate's classroom, pride shining in his eyes, as Zuri introduced Naomi to every student individually, providing detailed biographical information about each one as if she were conducting a diplomatic reception. This is Kai. He's really good at math. This is Destiny. She could do a cartwheel and a backflip. This is Simone. She has the best braids. I already told you about Simone. Naomi shook every hand. She remembered every name. 2 weeks later, Naomi announced the expansion of the Ashford Community Initiative School Program. She tripled its funding from $12 million to $36 million annually. She required every executive at Ashford Dynamics to volunteer at least once a quarter in a community program, not as a suggestion, but as a condition of employment written into their contracts. She established a new division within the foundation dedicated specifically to infrastructure repair and technology access for public schools in underserved neighborhoods across all 5 boroughs. She did not delegate the announcement to her communications team. She made it herself, standing in the auditorium of PS 247, flanked by Dr. Abrams and Mrs. Tate and 23 8-year-olds who had no idea what $36 million meant, but understood that their school was going to get a new roof and new computers, and that the nice lady who had laughed at their hamster was the reason why. When a reporter asked what had inspired the change, Naomi didn't mention strategy. She didn't mention tax incentives or brand positioning or stakeholder engagement or any of the language that typically accompanied corporate philanthropy announcements. She said one thing: an 8-year-old who understood gratitude better than most adults I know. The cameras loved it. The clip went viral within hours. By the end of the week, 3 other major corporations had announced similar initiatives, each one crediting the Ashford announcement as inspiration. Within a month, a coalition of tech companies had pledged a combined $200 million to public school infrastructure nationwide. But Naomi didn't care about the viral clip or the coalition or the headlines. What she cared about was the ceramic star that now sat on her desk on the 47th floor of the Ashford Dynamics building, positioned between a Crystal Award from the National Technology Council and a framed photograph of her father shaking hands with a former president. The star was crooked and chipped and painted in uneven strokes of yellow. It was the most valuable thing on the desk. Marcus's life changed too, though not in the ways he expected. He didn't become wealthy. He didn't become famous. He continued to run Okafor's Auto on Sutphin Boulevard, continued to wake up at 5:30 every morning to open the shop, continued to change oil and replace brake pads and diagnose engine problems with the quiet competence of a man who understood machines the way some people understood music. But the story of Zuri's visit to the restaurant had spread through their neighborhood in Queens like a warm current, and suddenly people who had driven past his shop for years without stopping began pulling in. Not because they needed a mechanic, although many of them did, but because they wanted to meet the man who had walked into a billionaire's dinner in an off-the-rack suit and taught the room something about courage. Marcus didn't know what to do with the attention. He was not a man who sought spotlight or craved recognition. He had raised Zuri alone since his wife Adiz had passed away 3 years ago from complications related to sickle cell disease, and his primary concern every single day was making sure his daughter had what she needed. Not what she wanted, because wants were infinite and resources were not, but what she needed. Food on the table, a safe place to sleep, books to read, someone who showed up every single day without fail and without condition. Adiz had been the dreamer in their family. She had been the one who believed that the world could be changed by small acts of love applied consistently over time. She had volunteered at the community center on weekends. She had organized coat drives every winter. She had baked pound cakes for every neighbor who had a birthday or a funeral or a Tuesday that felt heavier than usual. When she died, Marcus had tried to carry her legacy by raising Zuri the way Adiz would have wanted, with kindness as the foundation and everything else built on top of it. The gift bag and the ceramic star had been Zuri's idea. The visit to the restaurant had been Zuri's insistence. Marcus had provided the logistics, the subway fare, the courage to walk into a room where they didn't belong, but the impulse had been entirely his daughter's. She had come home from school one afternoon and told him that Mrs. Tate had explained where the money came from, and Zuri had decided immediately that the right thing to do was say thank you in person. Marcus had tried to redirect her. He had suggested a letter. He had suggested an email. He had suggested a phone call to the foundation office. Zuri had rejected all of these options with the absolute certainty of someone who believed that gratitude, real gratitude, required presence. You have to look someone in the eyes when you say thank you. she had told him. Otherwise, how do they know you mean it? He couldn't argue with that. He had never been able to argue with Adiz either, and Zuri had inherited her mother's stubbornness along with her smile. The night of the next executive dinner, 6 weeks after the first, Naomi arrived early. She chose a table near the window, the same table where she had been sitting when a little girl in scuffed sneakers had changed the trajectory of her year. She had added 2 extra place settings. When Marcus and Zuri stepped out of the elevator, this time invited, carrying formal invitations that had been hand-delivered to the auto shop by a courier who had seemed slightly confused by the address, no one stared. Or rather, people stared, but differently. Not with confusion or suspicion, but with recognition. The story had been told enough times that most people in the room knew who they were. "She's with me," Naomi said before anyone else could speak. And this time, it wasn't a defense. It was a declaration. A statement of alignment and affection and chosen family that transcended the boundaries of class and circumstance and all the other walls that people build to separate themselves from each other. Zuri slipped her small hand into Naomi's, and Naomi felt the warmth of it spread through her fingers and up her arm and into the locked room in her chest where her 8-year-old self had been waiting for 26 years to be remembered. Marcus watched them, his daughter and a woman once described as untouchable, laughing over dessert like old friends. Zuri was explaining the difference between igneous and sedimentary rocks with the intensity of a tenured geology professor, and Naomi was listening with the same focused attention she gave to merger proposals and quarterly earnings reports, except that her eyes were softer and her smile was wider, and she looked, for the first time since Marcus had met her, like someone who was not performing a role, but simply being herself. Kindness, Marcus realized, didn't flow in one direction. It wasn't a river that ran from the powerful to the powerless, from the wealthy to the struggling, from the people who had everything to the people who had nothing but a handmade ceramic star. It was a current that moved in circles, connecting everyone it touched, lifting all of them, teaching all of them, reminding all of them that the distance between a penthouse and a walk-up apartment was smaller than it appeared from either end. His daughter had taught a billionaire about gratitude, and the billionaire had taught his daughter that her voice mattered, that walking into a room where you didn't belong and saying what needed to be said was not foolishness but courage, and that courage, applied in small doses by ordinary people, could change the shape of the world. He thought about Adiz. He thought about what she would say if she could see Zuri now, sitting at a table 50 floors above the city, holding a billionaire's hand and explaining the geological composition of quartz with absolute confidence. He thought she would smile. He thought she would cry. He thought she would lean over and whisper in his ear, "See, I told you kindness was the answer." High above the city lights, in a room once ruled by power and prestige and the careful maintenance of hierarchies that kept some people at the top and others at the bottom, something quieter took root that evening. It didn't have a name, not exactly. It wasn't charity or philanthropy or corporate social responsibility or any of the other labels that organizations use to categorize their interactions with the world beyond their walls. It was simpler than that. It was one person seeing another person fully and without pretense and choosing to make room for them. It was a little girl who believed that gratitude should be delivered in person. It was a father who believed that his daughter's courage mattered more than his comfort. It was a woman who had spent her life building walls, discovering that the most important thing she could build was a door. Humanity, it turned out, was worth more than all the wealth in the world. And sometimes it arrived in a paper gift bag decorated with hand-drawn stars, carried by an 8-year-old in scuffed sneakers who understood something that most of the adults in the room had forgotten. That kindness is not a transaction. It is not an investment with an expected return. It is not a line item on a spreadsheet or a checkbox on a corporate responsibility form. It is the choice to see someone, truly see them, and to respond not with judgment or indifference, but with the simple, radical act of making room at the table. Zuri Okafor made room in a billionaire's evening. Naomi Ashford made room in her life. And Marcus Okafor, standing quietly at the back of a room full of strangers, made room in his heart for the possibility that the world his daughter believed in, a world where gratitude mattered and kindness counted, and people looked each other in the eyes when they said thank you, might actually be real. It was real. It had always been real. It just needed someone brave enough to walk into the room and prove it.